Hey everyone, Dennis Chang here. Welcome to another video. This is I think my third week in Japan, and I'm having a blast right here. So today's video is a video that I've been wanting to make for a while. We're going to be talking about the jazz blues. It's still part of my series about practicing, so make sure to watch my previous videos from the last few weeks. Now, if you're familiar with my videos, well, you know they tend to be very philosophical, and this video is no exception. Beyond the blues, from a practicing perspective, I want you to be thinking about why you should practice X or Y, in this case the blues. So for what purpose? As a jazz musician, why should we be practicing the blues? And before we start, since this video is offered to you for free, I need to plug a few things. Now, first of all, I need to thank JES International for supplying me with this amazing Godin guitar during my 2-month stay in Japan. They are the Japanese official distributors for a lot of brands, including Godin guitars, Phil Jones amplification, Fishman pickups, Tom Anderson guitars, and many other wonderful brands. And I just have to say that Japanese service is top-notch. If you ever find yourself in Nagoya, Japan, which is kind of like in central Japan, be sure to check out their offices, because not only are they distributors, they have recording studios. I think they also give music lessons in their facilities. Anyway, they are amazing people. And thank you so much for helping me out. I really, really appreciate it. This is a wonderful guitar. And then, some of the topics that we'll be discussing are addressed in some of my courses, namely the jazz, phrasing, and swing course that I have on SoundSlice, and the harmony course, well, the series of courses that I made also on SoundSlice, and you'll find the links in the description box. Now, in these courses, I go into quite a lot of detail, but in this video, it'll be more general. Furthermore, you can also check out my DC Music School, where I produce courses for a lot of musicians, such as Pat Martino, Ulf Akenius, Frank Vignola, John Stowell, Birelli Legrand, and many, many others. You can see how they approach the blues, and you'll encounter many different approaches. Last but not least, you can also buy some of my music. You'll find the links in the description box. Namely, if you buy from Bandcamp, I make a little bit of money. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And if you haven't yet, please like, subscribe, please comment, share, because it will help promote my channel on YouTube. And the more subscribers and the more views that I have, the more money I can make. And to be honest, the very little money that I make from YouTube goes directly into making more free videos for YouTube. If you can do just that for me, I appreciate it. And if you can't, oh well. Okay, on to the jazz blues. It's going to be philosophical, as I said. Lately, I've read many articles on the jazz blues, and I've watched on YouTube many teachers talk about it. And I think my video is going to be different. There's actually a lot of similar content out there. People will tell you that, for instance, if you want to learn jazz guitar, that it's absolutely essential that you learn to play a jazz blues. And then they go on to teach you a music school version of what a jazz blues is. And then they'll show you which scales and which arpeggios go over which chords. All that is nice, but first question, why do you have to learn a jazz blues if you're learning to play jazz guitar, or just jazz in general? What is the purpose? Well, the simplest answer is that it's one of the most common structures in jazz, so you're very likely to encounter it at any given jam session. At the bare minimum, it could be a good idea to know the structure of the jazz blues, know the chords. But then the next big question, what is a jazz blues? And this is where even a lot of teachers and pros may fumble at giving you a concrete answer. Let's just explore the term jazz blues. You have the words jazz and blues. So basically, most people would probably regard that as a blues structure, but played in a jazz context. But a blues structure, for many people who are coming from outside of the jazz community, would be probably something like this. I'll do it a little bit fast. In B flat. So notice towards the end, if you're a guitar player, you're probably familiar with this. I went to the 5 chord and then to the 4 chord. And then I did this very typical bluesy turnaround, which will represent these chords: B flat, B flat 7, E flat, E diminish. However, nowadays, when you go to most teachers and most music schools teaching jazz, the blues structure will feature an entirely different set of harmonies. And there can be little variations here and there, but essentially it's going to look something like this in the same key. A 1, 2, 3, 4. So I added a few chords there. Namely on bar 2, I added an E flat 7. And then towards the end, instead of having this 5 dominant to 4, we have a 2-5. And preceding that, we had a G7, which is the dominant of the 2 chord. If you don't know any of this theory stuff, it's okay. But basically, it's quite different from the typical blues that non-jazz musicians might be used to. Actually, real blues musicians would probably be familiar with quite a number of variations. At any rate, this will be the default structure that most jazz musicians are likely to play when referring to a jazz blues. And they will often say that this is the standard jazz blues form. However, as someone who has studied jazz directly from recordings and from a historical perspective, I'm here to tell you that no, it is not the standard form. It came to be this way over the years because of teachers and music schools and whatnot. But to really understand the standard form, you have to go back in time and see how things evolved to be the way they are. Go back in time. I mean, just check out the recordings. By today's standards, yes, okay, it is the standard progression. But back in those days, there wasn't really a fixed standard progression. You found quite a number of variations in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. You find fairly wide variations in the harmonies. Sometimes the quick change is omitted, that second bar, that would be omitted. Sometimes there's no 2-5, you just have a 5 chord. That's very typical of the 30s. Before going to the 2-5, instead of a G7 or whatever, D minor 7 flat 5 G7, you might have other things. You might just have one chord, or you might have this, or you might have like tons of different variations. Nothing was set in stone in those days. Of course, nowadays nothing is set in stone either. There are many people who are aware of these things, but generally among students, or even certain pros, when they refer to a blues, they always refer to this music school structure that I talked about. It is so deeply normalized that it's just assumed that it's going to be like that. When, if you check out certain songs, even popular jazz standards of blues, they didn't necessarily play those chords. And today's pedagogical approach also tends to be much more academic when approaching the jazz blues. Now, if you want to know the historical evolution of this chord progression in a jazz context, please check out my harmony course on Sound Slice. So, about this academic approach, a jazz teacher may tell you something like, okay, we're in the key of B flat, B flat 7. Here's the arpeggio. E flat 7. And then they'll tell maybe the corresponding scales. B flat mixolydian, E flat mixolydian, etc., etc. Now, this information is not wrong, but it is very academic. Nothing wrong with that either. The important question, though, would be the following. What does the blues mean to you? These same teachers will tell you that you have to learn the blues. It's just such an important part of jazz that you have to learn. But then they show you these arpeggios and these scales, and then they are no different than the approach to learning any other standard. like autumn leaves or all the things you are, whatever. Yet they say it's so important to learn the blues, as if to say that the blues is separate from these other standards. But the way they're teaching it, it's the same approach. So what's different? Following this logic, learning a jazz blues is no more important than learning any other standard, right? What is the blues? What is the jazz blues? I mean, we're using the same words, but they can have different meanings. The blues can refer to the structure that we talked about, any of the structures anyway. So most likely it's going to be 12-bar blues, but there are different blues structures out there. Some of them are 8 bars, some are 16 bars, etc. But most of the time it's 12 bars. That's how normalized things are today. So when we use the blues in that way, we're referring to a structure. However, the blues can also refer to a language, a style, a way of playing, and a way of phrasing. And the blues style can be played over any chord progression, but it is very typically suited for the blues structure. So what I mean by that is that you can play in a bluesy style over almost any song. Autumn Leaves for sure, All the Things You Are, Blue Bossa. These are songs that are not blues structures, but where you can play blues vocabulary over them. And the opposite could be true as well. You can play over a blues structure and not play in any bluesy way whatsoever. And that's quite common in a lot of modern jazz. And that would be what those teachers showing you, those arpeggios and those scales would be teaching you, not to play the blues, but to play over a blues structure. That is, that you treat the blues structure just like any other song out there, like Autumn Leaves, All the Things You Are, etc. So basically, a number of teachers out there are emphasizing the importance of studying the blues, and I guess they're meaning the blues structure, but they don't talk about the blues language. Two separate things. Why not? I don't know. I can't answer that for them. Maybe they're not good teachers. Who knows? But I can say that the blues, like the rhythm changes structure, maybe I should talk about rhythm changes at some point too. Leave a comment if you think I should. Anyway, these structures are paradoxical in many ways. You can do, as most teachers say, and learn to outline the changes, but you can also completely ignore the changes and focus on the blues language. And this blues language is very heavy, is dependent on a specific language, vocabulary, set of vocabulary and phrasing. And I remind you that you can do this over other chord progressions as well, but it is very, very typically suited for the blues structure. So essentially you have opposite approaches, and think of it as a spectrum. You can be here, you can be here, you can be somewhere on the spectrum, in the middle, more here, more there, doesn't matter. And another paradoxical layer is that when you approach it from the point of view of just learning to outline the changes, the main difficulty would be to master, I guess, your harmonic language, your fingerboard on the jazz guitar, to be able to outline set changes. But just because you can nail the changes doesn't mean that it sounds like the blues, nor does it necessarily mean that it sounds good. You can perfectly play the changes and sound quite bad. On the other hand, if you choose to ignore the changes, you can do just about anything bluesy, but it doesn't mean it'll sound good either. You can basically do anything, but that anything should still be somewhat coherent. And that's where the study of the blues language is very, very important. Because a lot of teachers, I've heard this many times, will say, oh, if you want to play the blues, just use the pentatonic scale, minor or major. So if you're in B flat minor, pentatonic. Okay, and then or major. But if I do this, does it sound bluesy to you? No, it doesn't. The blues goes far beyond pentatonics. The most difficult thing about playing in a bluesy way is that it has less to do with very specific scales or arpeggios and everything to do with the actual language, the vocabulary. Now, the language itself is often indeed made up of these components, minor, major, pentatonic scales, blues scales. but they are used in a very specific way. Practicing the pentatonic scale all over your fingerboard will get you nowhere in terms of understanding this language. Furthermore, if you look at players, for example, like B.B. King, they spend their entire career focusing on very specific parts of the fingerboard. I don't know them personally, but I doubt some of them know the fingerboard as well as some of you might, but they sure can play the blues. And then, in terms of fingerings, us guitar players were often taught these boxes. But if you look at blues musicians when they play the pentatonic scale, yeah, maybe they will use these boxes, but you often see them doing things like this. Why is that? For phrasing purposes. Playing the scale with this fingering allows you to do certain things like you can execute specific ideas with specific articulation, specific ornaments by arranging the scale in such a way. And also at this point, I want to make a disclaimer that I do not consider myself to be a blues expert by any stretch of the imagination. However, I think I know enough to be able to play a relatively convincing jazz blues or even a relatively convincing blues. But there are people out there who really, really specialize in this. When I was living in Taiwan, my roommate was one such person. Like, he was all about the blues and he knew so much about it. It was always a blast listening and watching him play. I did, nonetheless, spend some time listening and absorbing it to a certain extent, enough to get by. And that's precisely the thing that you're going to have to do if you want to play a convincing jazz blues. Now, in the context of jazz, a lot of the older players from the older generation, like the 30s, 40s, 50s, they tend to use a lot of blues. So Charlie Christian, Grant Green, Wes Montgomery, George Benson. And now some of these players use it more so than others. Like I said, it's a spectrum. There are no rules as to where you should fit on the spectrum. That's something that you're going to have to decide for yourself, feel it out. And there's actually an album that I listen to all the time. Well, not all the time, but quite often. It's an album by a saxophone player named Buster Smith, and the album is called The Legendary Buster Smith. And on that album, there are tons of bluesy tracks, and you'll be able to hear many different approaches. In this video, I'll give you some little hints to hopefully facilitate the process of how to learn the language. Now, the first thing to do is to understand the traditional phrasing of the blues. And I go into detail about this in my harmony course, so check it out. But essentially, well, if you take a 12-bar blues, it's traditionally divided into 3 parts. You have a statement, and then a repeated statement that's similar, not necessarily exactly the same, but similar enough in terms of the motif. And then you have a last part, which is kind of a resolution of everything. And they are divided into 4 bars, 4 bars, 4 bars. And you can hear this in quite a number of jazz standards that were composed over the blues. So for example, if you take Sonny Rollins' Tenor Madness, you have this. That's the first statement, the first 4 bars. Then you have the next one, which is similar, but just changed a little bit to fit the harmonies. And then you have the ending phrase to conclude everything. And it goes. 3 parts. So that's a song that was composed following the traditional phrasing. Then you have others like Sunny Moon for 2. And it's the same phrase 3 times across the three parts. However, there are also blues melodies that don't follow this traditional phrasing structure. Popular one like Billy's Bounce doesn't follow that structure. I guess you could say it's through composed. It is through composed. Relaxing at the Camarillo, also by Charlie Parker, same thing. So I'm just showing you that while the tradition exists, doesn't mean that you're forced to follow it all the time. There are no rules. You can do whatever you want. However, I can guarantee you that Charlie Parker knew about the tradition, and then he built upon that. He expanded. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that it could be a good idea to learn the traditional way first, so that you become very familiar with it, and then you can expand on it, because that's where a lot of the masters of the old masters are coming from. They knew about the basic way, and then all the new things that they did is a reaction to the traditional way, because if you keep doing this traditional way all the time, it gets boring. So they want to try something new. But to do something new, you had to know what the old was, I guess. So this phrasing structure is something that could potentially help you play a more convincing blues solo. In fact, check out my previous YouTube video, which is all about phrasing. Check out my course on phrasing and harmony. What else can I talk about? Well, this thing that I mentioned earlier, the quick change, bar 2 of the blues. Again, this way of playing the jazz blues, this music school way, is so normalized that when people teach it, they make it this chord such an important part of the jazz blues, when in fact, in the past, it was an optional chord. And to understand its historical evolution, well, you'll have to check out my course. But I'll try to explain it very quickly here. It's basically a way to break the monotony of having the one chord for too long. And how they came about coming up with the 4 chord is through voice leading. It's a very typical chord progression. 1 to 4, 1. And between the 4 and the 1, you put a dominant. Dominant, 4, 1. You can potentially encounter things like this, not just with blues, but quite a number of songs, like Honeysuckle Rose. Here comes the. There we go. Or songs like Dinah. Dinah, is there anyone finer? Or even modern jazz compositions. Or if you listen to the piano on the original recording, that's what they do. So they have that quick change and this sharp 4 diminished. It's all coming from voice leading. Again, this is a pretty big topic. I actually explained the historical evolution in my harmony course, so you should buy it. This quick change that you encounter on bar 2 might not necessarily be a 4 chord either. It can be other things, like in the example of Joy Spring, it could be 2-5. So in B flat, it can be like that. It can be 1-6-2-5. It can be quite a lot of things. It is just to break the monotony of having the one chord for too long. And what does this mean from a soloist perspective? It meant that because these chords were not so important, some soloists chose to ignore them in their improvisations. So if you're in the key of B flat, and furthermore, one thing, okay, traditionally it was 4, right? But then over time, people turned it into a 4 dominant to give it a more special flavor. Like if you had a B flat 7, and you turn the E flat to dominant, you have this chromatic motion. Back up here, so you have this interesting voice leading. But again, there are some recordings, I think Charlie Christian, a few, where you can hear the 4 chord, but he completely ignores it and just continues with his. I can't sing at the same. Because that E flat 7 is optional, it's passing. So that's something to keep in mind. Which chords are the important chords to you? Now, of course, you can choose to outline it, but you can also choose to ignore it if you feel that it's not important. And it's entirely possible. Those 2 choices are possible. Of course, if the accompanist is really insisting on that D flat, as a soloist, you probably don't want to insist too much on the D natural. But if it's just a bass player and you're the only soloist, then the dissonance will not be audible. So things can depend. And throughout the blues structure, especially the modern music school blues structure, you have to understand which chords are passing chords. For example, towards the end, I guess, yeah, bars 7, 8, you have all these variations, like D minor 7 or G7. These are also passing chords historically. And you can potentially choose to ignore them or think other sets of harmonies. The point is to know where you're going. And this is something that I teach in my harmony course. I call this harmonic direction. Because if you look at just the most essential blues structure, there are only 3 chords. 1 for the first 4 bars, 4 for the next 2 bars, back to 1 for the next 2 bars, and then 5 for the next 2 bars, and then resolution with a turnaround or something. Only 3 chords. That's like the most essential blues from a historical point of view. And everything that you add on top would be decorations. So melodically, I can't give you too much specific guidance. I can't tell you to play this scale or that scale or this arpeggio, because you'll have to develop your ears and vocabulary for this. Now, technically speaking, it is possible to just use notes from the minor pentatonic scale throughout. And if done with a good sense of phrasing, it can actually sound good. And actually, that melody to Sunny Moon for Two, it's precisely that. Right? It's just minor pentatonic throughout, ignoring all the changes. But if we look at things from a perspective where we feel the harmonies are somewhat important, then over the B flat chord, let's say you're playing like a B flat minor pentatonic. Then you have this D flat note, which is like, you can call it the sharp 3 or minor third, sharp 2, or sharp 9, or flat 3. It doesn't matter. I don't like labels. It's just this note is just a little bit of a special note over this chord. It has this sound, a bluesy sound. Now, how do you use this note? I mean, can you be used in a number of ways, but traditionally speaking, if you play this note, you might want to resolve back to 1. So, or it can resolve, or it can resolve upwards. Or other things like so going upward, then resolving to the 1. Then you have the E flat chord. This is a good opportunity because before we were in B flat, and then if you look at an E flat 9, it's practically a B flat minor chord. So instead of thinking something that's E flat based, think B flat minor based, and therefore B flat minor pentatonic. And if you really want to outline the E flat chord, instead of playing this A flat, which you could, but change it to a G natural. And then back to the B flat chord, we do the same thing. And then over this 5 chord, this is where a lot of jazz musicians, myself included, I like to start to play the changes there, but it's a personal choice. But you can also ignore it. Then you can focus on more bluesy ideas. But the bluesy ideas should have some sense of finality to it. Speaking of which, bluesy phrases, a lot of them are coming from the pentatonic world, but used in a very specific way. But it might not necessarily always be the case. There are other phrases like dun, 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 dun. It's coming more from an arpeggio, I guess, or for example, you have to hear it in your head. Sorry, I'm not a good singer. Another opportunity to play the changes would be before going to bar 5, going to the E flat chord, to show that we're going towards somewhere. So you play a phrase that indicates that we want to reach this E flat 7 chord. So like perfect opportunity to play your 2-5-1 phrases. These are just very general ideas because, like I said, ultimately you need to be listening to a lot of players to get the sound in your ears. And if you really want to sound very, very bluesy, you have to listen to players that do just that. So some of those musicians that I recommended earlier do just that to varying degrees. Some are more on the bluesy side, some are leaning more half-half, and a little bit less and less. It's up for you to decide how much of this spice you want to use in your own improvisations. Here are a few other cool patterns. Over the B flat chord. Or maybe this. Or over the E flat 7, typical Charlie Parker. Or here's kind of like a made up scale. G, B flat, C, E flat, and then back up to G. It works well over the B flat chord and also works over the E flat chord. And here's another pattern that works well over the B flat and E flat chords. Over the major chord, or even the E flat. Double stop, piano double stop style licks. Can also work here. Or over the C minor F7, this works really well. It's kind of like a conclusion phrase. Or you can have these rhythmic figures. Things like this too. So the rhythm, the phrasing, the accents, those are very important. Check out my course on phrasing. By the way, if you go to my SoundSlice page, there's a free section where I've published transcriptions of some Wes Montgomery solos like Sundown and The Thumb. And you can check out those solos to see how Wes mixes bebop and blues in his improvisation. Or you can also go to my DC Music School website to see how different artists are approaching the blues. So I hope this will get you to think a little bit about what the blues means to you. And hope it was useful. Leave a comment. Please like, please share, please subscribe. It makes such a huge difference. These videos take so much time to make, and I give them away for free. And whatever money I make from YouTube, as I said, it goes directly into making more content. every few months I get a check from Google for pretty decent amount of money. But actually, if you consider all the work that I put into it, it's really not a lot of money. And that money also not only goes into making more content, it even goes into hiring uh, people to help me, to assist me with different things, editing videos, recording, whatnot. In fact, at this moment, I don't make enough money from YouTube to be able to afford all that. It often comes out of my own pocket. So for those of you who do these things like and subscribe, comment, share, who buy my courses and all that stuff, thank you, thank you, thank you so very much. I really mean it from the bottom of my heart. Thank you.